But because they're generalist, they've been known to pollinate 72% of global food crops, not necessarily as the main drivers in global food crop pollination, but they play an important role. There was one study that found that when hoverflies were present in oilseed and strawberry production, they achieved similar seed set as a single honeybee colony, which I think is just remarkable given that they're unmanaged insects, unmanaged insects pollinators, unlike honeybees, where, you can place them near your crop and expect pollination to occur. So I want to highlight that their role is really quite impressive, that they're an important aspect in our food production.
From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is PolliNation, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. Hoverflies are in every garden in North America. They're often confused with bees, but they're from an entirely different order of insects. With me this week to talk about the biology of this diverse group of insects is Nina Miller. Nina is a master's student at OSU's Garden Ecology Lab and is focused on hoverflies. This episode is going to be a really great crash course in the variety of hoverflies, their varied life history patterns, and how you can encourage them into your garden. I also want to note that the Garden Ecology Lab has a unique way of supporting work like Nina's. Funding from community members goes to supporting 2 graduate students per year. I don't know any other program that does this. I'm going to leave the links in the show notes to the Garden Ecology Lab with instructions on how you too can donate and add your name to this group. But without further ado, let's take a deep dive into the world of hoverflies this week on PolliNation. Well, I'm so pleased to have you on the episode today, Nina. Welcome to PolliNation.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
I'm really excited as well. I don't think we've had a talk an episode dedicated to hoverflies. And I was super impressed by your knowledge of hoverflies. And I think you were recently at the bee event up in Albany talking about it. So really excited to have you on the show. And I guess maybe to begin with, hoverflies are probably so easily mistaken with bees. They visit flowers. What's the difference? How can somebody tell the difference between a hoverfly and a bee?
Yes, especially with the context that they rely on mimicry to exist in the world. It's known as Batesian mimicry, so they want to fool you. But there are a few tools that you can use to differentiate them. The first, of course, hoverflies are flies, and every member within the fly order, they only have one pair of wings. So that second pair of wings that you would see on bees are heavily reduced into what's called a haltere, which kind of acts as a gyroscope that allows them to make the rapid movement. This also changes their flight pattern, which, of course, they're hoverflies, so they hover.
Ah.
Next one, hoverflies, they tend to have rounder eyes. They have the iconic housefly eyes that you typically won't see in bees. Hoverflies
Because
also...
the bee's eyes are much smaller. There's more head to bee ratio.
Yeah. I more think of bee eyes, this is, more of a generalization, but I think of bee eyes as like a superhero mask, whereas like a fly eyes are more like a, the scuba diving orbs kind of.
Okay.
That's how I imagine them.
Okay, keep going.
Yeah. Next, hoverflies have very thin hind legs. They don't have any sort of specialized structures or hair to aid in pollen adhesion or pollen transport. Again, not a strict rule, but more of a guideline. There are some species of hoverflies that have thick hind legs, but not to aid in any sort of pollen collection. And then, of course, hoverflies, they have short, stubby antennae. Bees tend to have more long and uniform antennae. I feel like this is a key that's can see it a little bit easier in the field, which is quite helpful. And then, of course, hoverflies can't sting. The female bees, they have stingers. Male bees don't, but hoverflies, female or male, they don't sting, which is great for us when we're out collecting. We don't have to worry about getting stung. It's a great plus. One thing I like to add to this is a characteristic that you can really see best under a microscope, but I think it's important to note. Most members of this family, the hoverfly family, they have something called a spurious vein on their wing. No other family of insects have such a trait. Not
Wait,
all.
spurious in terms of like, are you really a vein or not?
Yes, exactly. Yes, yes. Yeah, it's a false vein. Yeah, it's
Okay.
false vein, but it's a helpful tool, especially for some of the hoverflies that don't look like bees. They look more like your typical housefly. So that's one of my favorite diagnostic tools when I'm IDing syrphid.
Maybe people don't know what a vein is on a wing. What is spurious vein? Like how? Why is it false looking? Maybe tell us about that quickly.
Yeah, so on insect wings, there's venation, you have wing veins. Some of these, the way that they're laid out can be helpful in guiding identification. On hoverflies, they have this half vein that kind of divides the wing in half, that front main wing in half. It's kind of hard to describe, without an image, but it's more of like a paintbrush stroke, just
Oh,
halfway across the wing. It's quite cool.
I'm
Yeah.
gonna take a look the next time I look.
Yeah, I would recommend it. They're pretty cool.
Well, I guess this, now we're maybe at my. I knew the difference between a hoverfly and a bee, but for me, hoverflies are one thing. I just put them all into one bucket. Now I understand from talking to you that they're really taxonomically diverse. Can you maybe open our eyes to the diversity of hoverflies?
Yes, I would love that. Yeah, so, hoverflies, they all belong in a single family, the Syrphidae, but there are four notable subfamilies. Four of them include the Pipisinae, so the pitheads and kin, the Microdontinae, so the ant flies. We have the Syrphinae, which are the typical hoverflies, and the Aristallinae, which are more like your drone flies. And they all have very varied life histories, especially in their larval form. The Pipisinae, they're all predaceous as larvae, so they eat aphids, scale insects, and thrips, so they're very valuable in garden systems. They're flower visitors as adults, so they're important in pollination. The Microdontinae, they're one of my more curious subfamilies that I think are very interesting. All of the brood stages of this Microdontinae, they all reside in ant colonies. They're considered parasites of an entire ant colony. So as larvae, the Microdontinae eat ant brood. There's a lot of questions about, the extent of their larval diet since they exist in ant colonies, so it's hard to observe them. But interestingly, they look a lot like bumblebees when they're adults, but they're not flower visitors, which is
Huh.
quite curious to me. Yeah.
How did they get into the ant colony?
Yeah, that's a great question. They release a pheromone that fools the ants into bringing the eggs into the colony.
Oh,
It's it's magic. It's magic. Yeah, there's talk that the egg laying adults will lay the eggs just outside the colony or time it in a way where the egg will fall into the colony. But again, this subfamily is there are a lot of mysteries about it. there are many mysteries, but
Okay,
hopefully,
but we're two in. We got more to go.
yes, we are two in. We are two in. So the third one is the Surfinae, so the typical hoverfly. And this is a subfamily that you'll see the most out and about in Oregon. Like the Pipizinae, they are predaceous as larvae, so they eat a lot of the common garden pests. So your aphids, scale insect, thrips, mealybugs. They're quite a helpful insect. And then the adults are pollinators. And then our last subfamily is the Aristallinae, and this is the most diverse subfamily when it comes to natural history is larvae. Their diets really vary. Some of them eat detritus, some of them eat feces, some fungus, and some of them consume plant matter.
Wow.
Because of the different diets, their bodies are drastically different. So, with the larvae that consume plant matter, they have more of a compressed body. Think of it more like a caterpillar, without any sort of pro legs or aid and but they're very different, the ones that eat plant matter from the ones that consume detritus. So the ones that consume detritus are your iconic rat-tailed maggot that exist in more aquatic systems and are very much a blob organism. But despite all of the varied diets as larvae, all the adults are flower visitors, so they're all important pollinators.
Are these in this group? Is it monophyletic, or does it or the dung eaters, and do they just emerge multiple times? Is it
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. I know the Pipizinae, they're
Pisne?
so the Pipizinae was the first subfamily that
Oh, okay. Sorry.
yeah, they were originally classified within the Aristallinae, and it I think it was 20 years ago that they were reclassified into their own individual group. So more to say that the Aristallinae, that subfamily, is quite complex, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was paraphyletic, but I'm not sure.
Fascinating. Well, what are we looking for in terms of species counts? Let's say
Hmm,
in North America for this whole group.
I don't know. Yeah, I do not know.
Oh, not for the Aristolinae, but just for the hoverflies.
For the hoverfly, I'm not sure.
Okay, well that is a good telling answer, because if one was studying bees, you would know immediately 4,000, and it does suggest to me that there's a lot of species that remain undiscovered, or there's a lot of it's hard to get a count.
Yeah, especially with the microdontinae, since they exist most of their life in ant colonies, and then the adults aren't flower visitors, so they're kind of a mystery of a subfamily, which is just quite fascinating to me.
I guess I think this is super fascinating. A group of flower visitors, not all of them, that you see have such diversity in life history. Is there anything more that you want to tell us about sort of these patterns of diverse life history and with relation to hoverflies?
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things that I like to talk about is, because of the varied life histories, they hold very special roles in ecosystem services. So, we have the predaceous larvae that consume very significant garden pest insects and agricultural pest insects. A great number that I like to highlight is that 1/3 of all of the Syrphidae are predaceous on aphids. So this doesn't include,
Wow.
yeah, it's a huge number, but that doesn't include, your thrips or your mealybugs. So I just think that is such an impressive value to highlight. To kind of further that number, there was a report that showed one species was able to consume between 100 and 500 aphids throughout their larval stage, where they
Wow.
spend about 1 to 3 weeks in that stage, which is just an astounding number of aphids consumed. I would say about 3 times the size of aphids, but it's still just such an impressive number.
That is really amazing. And so that's one ecosystem service
Mm.
that they're providing, but I suppose when you consider the breadth of the maybe people don't even know what an ecosystem. I'm almost positive most people have heard the term before, but maybe tell us, what is an ecosystem service, and tell us some of the other services that these. I mean, you've sort of alluded to them when you went through the different taxa, but why don't you just kind of give us a broader view of the ecosystem services of hoverflies?
Absolutely. So, an ecosystem service is defined by actions or behaviors of an organism that benefit the environments or human. And so, hoverflies provide pollination, predation, which we just talked about, and decomposition. Pollination is an ecosystem service that they'll only provide as adults, and predation and decomposition when they're larvae.
Okay, thanks for doing that. Oh, keep going, Nina.
Yeah, of course. So then we have our second ecosystem service, which is decomposition. So these are hoverfly larvae that consume detritus. Some of them will consume matter that is not in an aquatic system. One of the most common ones here is by the thick-legged hoverfly. We found a great number when we were collecting one day from a compost pile. And then we have the aquatic detritivores, which will exist in aquatic systems, often from agricultural runoff. But decomposition and detritivores, they're essential in carbon and nutrient cycling, and without them, the world would not exist as we know it today. I like to think they're really the base of what our world exists on. Without decomposers or detritivores, plants wouldn't have access to essential nutrients and production would simply stop. So, despite their unsightly appearances, they're essential in the function of life as we know it.
Unsightly how?
Oh, yes. So, the rat-tailed maggot is, you know,
Already sounds unsightly.
it's one you would be okay never seeing, I think. They're very much just kind of a blob. They kind of look like leeches a little bit. They have more of a beige tone to them, and they have something called a respiratory siphon or anal breathing tube that allows them to breathe outside of the water while their body remains in the water. They have no specialized or support structures because they exist in the water, so it's the blobfish of the insect world.
Okay. Well, we've got detrivores and we've got pollination as two ecosystem services. You said three.
Yes, so then we have pollination, and this is done
But no,
by
we did pollination, didn't
oh,
we? Oh no,
yeah.
detrivores. I thought we have things that eat.
So we had predation, decomposers.
Oh yes, we didn't do pollination.
Oh yeah, I realize I
Oh
have my list all confused when I
no, no, you got it perfect. Take it away, Nina. Pollination.
yes. So hoverflies, of course, are pollinators as well. So they're something called a generalist pollinator. So they'll visit flowers from many different plant families. I like to think that they're mainly limited by what their little spongy mouth parts can reach. So they tend to visit flowers within the aster or the daisy family. They visit flowers in the carrot family, so the Apiaceae, the cabbage family, the Brassicaceae, and often in the buttercup family, or the Ranunculaceae. But of course, that list is non-exhaustive, and they've been known to visit many different plant families. Those are just the top four I like to think of.
I think about the little spongy tongues, and I think about a carrot flower, which is really small. Like they're kind of little narrow. They're not very deep. Those
Yeah.
little spongy tongues, can they kind of like goosh in? Like, are they kind of like, I don't know, moldable?
I believe it's more, kind of they rely on the suction around.
Okay.
So I don't know if they go all the way down to the bottom of the flower tube, but they're
Whatever they can suck up.
yeah, it's a popular family. They love the cilantro and the dill and the Queen Anne's lace. Those are when the Queen Anne's lace was blooming, they are around. It's quite impressive actually. But because they're generalist, they've been known to pollinate 72% of global food crops, not necessarily as the main drivers in global food crop pollination, but they play an important role. There was one study that found that when hoverflies were present in oilseed and strawberry production, they achieved similar seed set as a single honeybee colony, which I think is just remarkable given that they're unmanaged insects pollinators, unlike honeybees, where, you can place them near your crop and expect pollination to occur. So I want to highlight that their role is really quite impressive, that they're an important aspect in our food production.
I remember you talking about this, and it comes to the next question I wanted to ask you about that. Bees have this, what we often think of as this big strength. They've got this nest, which you can move around in the case of honeybee colonies, and then they just sort of provision pollen for that nest. But hoverflies don't have a nest. They are not anchored down that way. Tell us a little bit about that, and maybe also how it contributes to pollination efficacy.
Yeah, so bees show something called central place foraging. So they forage around this common area, typically a hive or, wherever they have their nest. Hoverflies don't have that, so they are not set to any given area. Because of that, they're highly mobile, which aids in introducing plant diversity, which is really important when it comes to pest resistance. It's important to have that genetic diversity. They also participate in long range pollen transport. And despite not being as fuzzy as bees, they've been able to transport pollen up to 400 meters, which is quite an impressive range. I look at them and they're not very fuzzy. They don't have that specialized pollen collecting structure, and yet it's been recorded that they can still transport pollen for such an impressive distance. So, yeah, it this lack of central place foraging, it improves plant genetics. It alleviates pollinator congestion, especially in agricultural systems where, you have your honeybee hives, so it's high densities of pollinators. So because of this lack of central place foraging, they can move to areas that have less pollinators and maybe need pollination services more than other areas.
I suppose that distance as well, maybe it was listeners in their minds, it's kind of like the gene flow, that it could be that you have a plant that has some self-incompatibility issues. And so if pollen came from from, you know, hundreds of feet away, it may be compatible pollen, and that might result in the better yield, is that you're bringing pollen genetics in that need to travel a little bit. The ones close by may not necessarily lead to viable seeds.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I, I've mentioned this a few times in some of my previous talks, but, bees, as far as I know, no bees participate in long-range migration. Hoverflies do. Of course, not all hoverflies, but there are a few species in the United States that participate in long-range migration. Not all individuals within these species participate in that migration, but some do. And this is just another added tool for dispersal, which I think is just so incredibly impressive given their small body size. And, they're such a curious group of insects. I think they're just so funny.
Give us a long how. How long are we talking
Yeah.
about? What does long range mean?
There there has been records of long-range migration up to 300 kilometers,
Oh my goodness.
which is a huge distance to travel. They tend to break that travel up into different generations, or they will use the wind currents to propel their movement from different stages. The study that goes into this, it's mostly been done in Europe, but there have been a few studies that have happened in the US and Canada that has recorded this. Because of the migration, they've noted different body characteristics that arise because of this. Syrphids that participate in long range migration tend to have larger wings, they tend to have smaller bodies, but there has been record of syrphids traveling from the Midwest to Canada, which is an incredible distance.
Oh,
Very impressive.
wow. Really, like, more and more, I'm learning how these insects that may look superficially like bees are nothing like them.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
What
They're fascinating.
I can tell your fascination and your curiosity with this group of insects, and you're currently doing research. Tell us a little bit about what your research is focused on.
Yeah, so I'm doing my master's degree with the Garden Ecology Lab here at Oregon State University. What I'm looking at is syrphid community composition. So, what syrphids are in Oregon, but specifically in urban Oregon gardens. So, we had 15 gardens in Portland and 15 gardens in Corvallis, and we looked at how floral cover, tree cover, what flowers are around. We're this upcoming summer, we're looking at how landscape composition might influence their community composition. So that is what species are present, how many individuals of a given species, and what the syrphid diversity is in each individual garden, each individual city, and between the two cities.
Wow. We're all wanting to know a little bit about what you're finding.
Yes. Yeah. So, one part of this study is looking into plant genus associations with the flower visiting syrphid adults. We have found that parsley, Douglas aster, California poppy, yarrow, and Queen Anne's lace were impressive hotspots when we were collecting insects. We collected a total of 792 syrphids from 28 different taxa, so genus and species. There are some genera within the Syrphidae, so that family of syrphids that don't have very good taxonomic support, so we're able to narrow that down. But 28 different taxa was a very impressive yield, I have to say, for the the amount of time we spent collecting. I also wanted to highlight some some most abundant species that we collected. The first one was the thick-legged hoverfly, which I think I mentioned when we were talking about ecosystem services with detritivores. As larvae, the thick-legged hoverfly are detritivores. They're an introduced species from Europe, and we collected 184 of those. Next, we caught 78 species, sorry, 78 individuals, 78 species would be impressive, of the European drone fly, which are the rat-tailed maggots as larvae. So they are decomposers, and they're also introduced from the Palearctic. Then we have the calligrapher, which is Toxomerus occidentalis. We collected 61 of those. They're predaceous as larvae, and they're native to Oregon. As kind of a fun anecdote, I love this species so much. They're called calligraphers as their common name. The females of this species, their abdomen looks like a little calligraphy nib. So if you have time, look it up. I would recommend it. They're quite cute. And then we caught 59 individuals of the globe tails. They're predaceous as larvae, and they're also native to Oregon. And then our last species was Eupioides fumipennis complex. The males were able to identify the species, but the females, there are 3 species that are difficult to differentiate without genomic testing, which we don't have access to. But we collected 58 from that species complex. They're predaceous as larvae, and like the past 2 syrphids, they're also native to Oregon. Some of our preliminary findings, just based on the abundance counts, was that cooler temperatures tended to increase our syrphid collection. We collected between 60 degrees Fahrenheit to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And it was interesting that they tended to be more present in cooler temperatures.
Huh.
We also found that with increasing floral cover, so that is in gardens where there was more consistent floral resources throughout the garden, there were higher counts of syrphids. So those are just some preliminary findings. We hope the further analyses go, we'll be able to find more interesting relationships. But I thought those with temperature and floral cover were just quite interesting to see.
So the floral cover, it is not amount of flowers per acre, but it's the amount of consistent flowers. Yeah, could tell us a little bit what's in that metric.
Absolutely. So we collected along transect lines. So this is a 15-meter by 1-meter transect line. And in each 1-meter square block, so there are 15 blocks along a single transect line, we would count if there were flowering plant families present or absent. So this could mean there could be 10 Douglas asters, and it would get a presence count within that family. So that's the
Gotcha.
so that 1-meter transect area could host many different plant families, but say only 6 flowers in total. So it was less a metric of, abundance and resource availability, but more what was around. Yeah, it's difficult to measure resource abundance without directly measuring, what pollen and what the pollen composition is within flowers. So this was just a kind of one route that we took to hopefully see any sort of correlation.
Well, it looks like you are, and yeah, I guess this kind of leads into, I know you're early in on the work, but
Mm.
we've had lots of episodes where people have talked about how to support bees. You're the first person we've ever had who can give us a message about what gardeners can do to encourage the diversity of these hoverflies on their property. And I guess that was one of them right there, just that there is seems to be this relationship between floral diversity
Mhm.
and the number of species you're going to find.
Yeah, at least with abundance counts. We haven't looked at how it'll affect richness, but with abundance counts, I think that was a very interesting note that it at least influences one of those community composition metrics that we were hoping to look at. So some of the things that you can support syrphids in your garden, kind of what I mentioned earlier, we have the parsley, the California poppy, the common yarrow, and the Douglas aster that were hotspots for these syrphids. Next, and I think this was a very interesting article that I read. It talked about how pairing native plants with non-native plants alleviated some of the stress that the specialist bees experienced with generalist foragers. And syrphids are generalist foragers. Even the native syrphid species are generalists. So this is a quite an interesting tool to have a more interactive garden where you can have specialist insects on those native plants with the generalist, not necessarily introduced, but the generalist insects on those non-native plants. Next, I I've been encouraging gardeners to be hesitant about incorporating shallow water features into their garden that are not treated with BT. So, this is a bacterial insecticide that specifically targets Diptera larvae, so the fly order larvae. So, it'll target, your mosquitoes and your crane flies in the water. This recommendation comes around, I mentioned the rat-tailed maggot, which is it's a larval form of the European dronefly, which is an introduced species. Because there's not a lot of research going into, invasive status of some of these syrphids, I don't want to speak in absolutes, but it has been recorded that this European dronefly has been pushing out a native species that occupies a similar habitat, and there have only been a few counts of this native species. They've been pushed out along the mountain ranges with only a few counts since the early 2000s. So this has been one of the recommendations that I've been hopeful to share in potentially minimizing that European dronefly population in the hopes that we can see this native species come back. Next, I have been encouraging people to plant more trees, especially in areas with high heat index, so areas with larger portions of impermeable spaces. So, a lot of concrete, a lot of buildings, not a lot of green spaces to manage the temperature flow. I think there are larger policy changes on, expanding green spaces in cities equitably and reducing the use of fossil fuels. But this is a really excellent way and direct actions that gardeners can take to reducing the stress experienced during high heat days, even with bees. So it's really kind of an all-purpose tool for most beneficial insects. And then kind of the second to last one, people have been composting less or simply not at all. And, we have this whole group, this whole subfamily of insects that have been known to be decomposers and benefit from composting systems. So I've been encouraging people to think about how they can incorporate a compost pile into their gardens. You can remove most of the compost smell by layering leaves and, different brown matter with the green matter. So, you know, you have your grass, you have your dried leaves, you have food scraps, you have, cardboard, undyed cardboard. And then, of course, practicing IPM is just a really excellent way to further support syrphid populations. All stages of the syrphid life cycle are vulnerable to pesticide poisoning, but especially the brood stage with the egg, the larva, and the pupa, because they're not as mobile as the adults. But I love IPM where, you know, chemical control or they're your last it's your last line of defense after you've tried everything else, where you tolerate a few insect pests, a few garden pests, because of course that's what a few of the syrphid larvae consume. So if you don't have any garden pests, you won't have any syrphid larvae to consume them. So I think IPM is a really nifty tool in supporting a wide variety of beneficial insects and is will be helpful in preserving those syrphid species.
I suppose they're also part of the integrated pest management. I remember we had an episode, a couple years ago with Iwasaki Brothers Nursery where the the nursery manager would use sort of the accumulation of syrphids over certain nursery plants as an indication of like pest pressures rising. And also really tried to encourage them at the same time, was really trying to think about ways to bring them into the nursery production. But they knew that was also an indicator that aphid pressure was building up, and she could just walk through the greenhouse and spot the hot spots and then be very deliberate with her pest management.
Yeah, I mean they're a natural enemy. Yeah, they're our pal in garden systems. Yeah, they're a fascinating group, and this is around the time where you'll start seeing the larva more. I If you have any sort of brassica, so any, mustard, kale, cabbage, broccoli, if you look under the leaves, especially if you have aphid infestation and you see kind of like very kind of slug-like, it is likely that it's a hoverfly larva, and that's one of my favorite things to do is look under the leaves of, aphid-infested plants. I'm trying to see if I can find one. They're very they're very charming. They're very charming.
Well, Nina, we really appreciate you taking time to tell us about this fascinating group of insects, and we hope to have you back on the show as your research starts to coalesce into you start to get some findings that come together and are able to tell us a little bit about the patterns you're seeing in Portland gardens.
That would be great. Thank you so much for having me. It was a true honor.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.